Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of the Corporate Services Committee to order. It is 12:30. I'll start by reading a statement. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternative formats and communication supports for council, standing, or advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we have a number of consent items, 2.1 through 2.5. I've been asked to deal with 2.1 and 2.2 separately. I just look to see if any colleagues want to deal with 2.3, 4, or 5 separately as well, or could we potentially put those together in a motion? So does anybody want to separate out 3, 4, and 5 at all? No? Okay. I'd look for a mover for 2.3, 2.4, and 2.5. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Kaibaga. So that is City of London's Budweiser Gardens Days, Canada's Walk of Fame, the Employee Absenteeism Report 2018, and the reduced hours of operation and holiday closure pieces. Any discussion on those? Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question on employee absenteeism 2.4. It seems like although we are below where we were in 2007, when we more or less started to formulate policy on this, that was a little more clear, shall we say, that it's still higher than we'd like it to be. And I'm wondering, is that primarily because of an aging workforce, or are there other reasons that are going with that? If I could present that to staff.
Mr. Coxhead.
Thank you, through the chair. There's a variety of reasons. One of them is an aging workforce. With respect to as we all get a little older, sometimes we're not able to work at the same capacity as we might have. The other one is with respect to our concerted efforts with respect to mental health. With reducing the stigma associated with mental health and the absenteeisms associated with that, there's likely more folks taking time associated with their mental well-being as well. And depending on the work group and the type of work we're doing, but you know, we used to have a lot of absences associated with lower back pain and garbage and removal. You know, those are almost gone away with active and preventative methodologies to deal with those. And folks are transitioning to other methodologies and to meet their needs to support themselves and their families.
Thank you for that. I can recall 2007, the city hired a consulting firm to look into it at a professional level with some depth. And I recall that the report that came back actually highlighted that there was, at least in 2007, a culture of entitlement to take these days off, even though they weren't perhaps necessary medically or psychologically to take them off. Is any of that still in the mix?
Through the chair, that's a hard one to quantify, if at all. And in that respect, we have an active absenteeism program for culpable or non-culpable absenteeism that put people in programs that have regular absences, and we work closely with individuals to ensure that they have a safe and early return to work for absences. And that's one of the main reasons that there's been a decline. People have to explain their absences to us more fully than they had back in 2007. And there's lots of good work to do and folks here to do it most of the time.
We used to hear the figure, we've been saving about $1 million a year with the lower absenteeism levels since 2007. Is that still the case? Are we roughly in that range?
I believe we're even further lower than that. It's not an actual saving. This is actual people at work now serving Londoners through their being here at work. So there's not a direct savings per se as in a dollar amount, but as a, while folks are attending at work more regularly, they're able to service Londoners better.
Okay, I appreciate that. The reason I mentioned that is it used to show up in the reports, a dollar amount, about how much we were saving. And so it's good to hear that you're stating that we're actually above the million or below, depending on how you're looking at it.
I don't want to be held to $1 million as a fact. So we haven't provided that information. I know that absentee, if it was high then, it's lower now.
Okay, again, I'm just mentioning what we used to get in the report. It used to be in print, the $1 million a year. So for whatever reason, if that's changed or we're no longer going to print that.
I think the report is what the report is now. If you're asking about the report from 2007, like,
Sure.
you can look those up.
No, it used to come in yearly, or actually quarterly. And it used to be in the report about the dollar savings. So I don't know, is that quantifiable? It was at one point. It's not now, or it can be, or?
It hasn't been included in reports since I've assumed the role. So it's likely quantifiable. I don't know.
Councillor Helmer.
I believe Mr. Cox had tried to address it, but I would say the number of hours, average hours is down, and certainly the cost per hour is up, right? Like over time, people are making more money than they were in 2007, so I think it's very clear that it would be less than whatever was reported in the past, because the cost per hour is up and the number of hours is down.
Great. Any further discussion on 2.3, 2.4, or 2.5? Seeing none, we'll open that for voting.
Councillor Van Meerbergen? Closing the vote, the motion's passed 5-0.
The next item is our first consent item, 2.1, which is the provincial budget and recommended provincial budget and recent proposed legislative changes with financial impacts. I think things have kind of changed since the printing of this report just a little bit. So perhaps we should hear from our treasurer about any updates or new information that has arisen as we consider the two directions, one to receive and one to direct some continued advocacy efforts, which are the items coming out of this report.
Thank you through the chair. And as you can tell, as we provide information on this, we receive a lot of information subsequent to writing it. So it's only as current as we can keep up with it. But certainly we received more information that suggests. So we've quantified the 2019 impact, which is obviously the retroactive impact that we have for our current year budget, separately from those in future years. So what we understand is that since the time of writing this report, that the province has retroactively removed the changes that would be retroactive. And what that means is some of the impacts in 2019 that we had identified will no longer come to fruition. So we do not believe at this time, and we're still waiting for clarification, but we do not believe it's the full $4 million. That is only the changes with respect to childcare, public health, as well as EMS, which is approximately $3.1 million of the $4 million that we have identified. So obviously, one of the things that we have flagged in the recommendation and that we will continue to do is to have ongoing discussions with the province to try to understand what the impacts are, to get additional information. And I think certainly the biggest piece is that the more information we can receive in advance to identify what the impacts will be starting in 2020 will certainly very much help us in the development of our multi-year budget.
Questions from committee? I look for a mover and a seconder for the items in the committee report, which is to receive the information and direct civic administration to continue advocacy efforts. Councillor Van Meerbergen, Councillor Hillier. Oh, okay. But do you want to move it or no?
I'll move it, sure.
Okay, sure. Moved and seconded. Go ahead with questions.
Yeah, I just have a question for staff. On page 3, there's mention that there are some changes that may relieve pressures on the city's tax levy. Could we be a little more specific as to what changes may relieve pressure?
Ms. Bourgon.
Through the chair, so we have an idea that there's many, as you note within the report, that there's still impacts that are unknown and cannot be quantified at this point in time. So it's through some of those additional ones that could potentially. So I think one of the key things is if you look at, and I can use the example of potentially EMS and or public health, that if you have a broader service and there is potentially economies of scale, that at some point that our share, even though it has gone up, we might realize some benefits from that in the long run. Again, very, very early on, but certainly there's a large number of items where we don't know what the impacts are going to be. And if there are things that potentially, in addition to additional cost sharing, that might in fact remove some things that we potentially pay for today. I think conservation authorities, there's a number of things in the registry right now that the province is actually looking at changing and no longer having them do in the future. If that were to come to fruition, again, that would be something that we pay for today that we may no longer be obligated. So we're really just ballparking that at this point. There's still a great deal of information that is unknown that throughout the next number of months and potentially years, as we see what additional legislative changes come forward, might make that apparent to us.
Go ahead.
So it's fair to say there may be actually some positives coming down the pipe in addition to some pressures. So that's a fair statement. Well, since I have the floor, I'm wondering, I think it may make some sense in Part B if we were perhaps to add that the City of London continue to work with AMO as well as, since we're not in this alone, we're in this together as municipalities in Ontario. And I'm sorry, it escapes me in terms of the acronym. Is it LUMCO? Perhaps we could do AMO and LUMCO as an amendment, like just to add an added amendment.
I could handle this two ways. We could be very specific about it. It does direct continued advocacy efforts, of which I do know that a regular part of our advocacy efforts and one of the main mechanisms is through our provincial associations. So the other thing I could do, I know our government relations team is here, and I could go through Mr. Hayward to confirm what that actually includes. And if the committee feels we need to be very specific, we could, but let's get the information on what is actually included in the direction already. Mr. Hayward.
Well, through the chair, a major part of our advocacy is through AMO and is through LUMCO. And there's a number of other associations that we deal with, the Treasurers Association, City Managers Association as well, all of which are trying to move in the same direction to deal with these issues and get clarity on them and make sure that the municipal approach is advocated for at the provincial level. So that is very much a part of it.
So those organizations as well as others are contained within the continue advocacy efforts. So I'll leave it in your hands to decide whether you feel we need to be more specific or not.
No, if this current motion covers that, then that's great. Thank you.
Other comments on this? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I see that there's a suggestion that we're going to need more staff to handle official plan amendments, zoning amendments, because the timelines are changing so that they're shorter. And to turn around the applications, we're going to need to increase staff. One of my concerns is that those increases in costs don't get passed on to the property taxpayer. We just went through a round of revisions to the planning application fees. Been some time since we adjusted them. They were adjusted in September of last year. I think unfortunately we're gonna have to look at adjusting them again because we can't just have these kind of increases come in and just get passed on. So now we have to meet these shorter timelines so we don't have things going off to what is now, you know, the recreated OMB. We're gonna have to make decisions in a timely manner, meet those legislative timelines. And I don't want the property taxpayers to be stuck with the costs for that. It needs to be shared, obviously, with the people who are coming in for planning applications. So I know that our staff are aware of these kind of pressures. I just wanted to check through the chair that something like that is being considered as a way of, you know, preventing all of this rolling onto the property taxpayer.
Go ahead.
Through the chair, so items such as that, excuse me, we will look at through our budget development process as well. We also have the service review that is looking at user fees currently as well that will have some recommendations. So given that we know there are some potential impacts, I would expect that that'll be some of the areas that I would hope they will address through that review to ensure that our cost recovery will be adequate and that we can follow through with changes through the multi-year budget to address.
Any further discussion? Okay, this has been moved and seconded. If there's no other discussion, we will open this for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 5-0.
Okay, item 2.2 is the last item in the consent. That is the council policy manual. So we'll have that on the floor for discussion. I'll look to committee for any comments. Seeing none, I actually just have a question because I know the question was raised in the community about the elimination of the Affordable Housing Reserve Implementation Policy. I was looking for some clarity on that particular policy and whether there's any consequences to eliminating that at this time. I think I understand what the report says, but I know that there's been some discussion. I think some additional clarity is probably warranted.
Through the chair, so this reserve fund is the old reserve fund that the City of London used to previously contribute $2 million annually. Since the time that this was created, a number of years ago, the HDC was created. The City of London is the sole shareholder of that corporation. So the amount that used to previously go into this reserve fund now goes to the HDC, as they are now the service manager responsible for the creation of affordable housing. So therefore, this reserve fund is being wound down as the previous commitments that were made against that fund are finishing up. It's taken a number of years for those outstanding commitments to come to fruition, and the remaining of that balance, once it's complete, and that reserve fund is all of the new monies are now being held by the HDC to support their creation of affordable housing. So we no longer require the reserve fund anymore, because once the balance is fully used up, there will be nothing left and all future stuff is going through the HDC. So therefore, we're repealing the policy because the reserve fund will be zero very shortly.
Just a follow-up question. We're engaging in what is one of the deep dive service reviews of the way that we provide housing, including the HDC as well as LMHC. Should there be any changes to that particular structure, which I don't know what the review will entail, would keeping this policy on the books until that is complete be valuable, or would we be building a new policy from the ground up based on whatever the results of that review would be?
Through the chair, because this policy is so old, it doesn't actually reflect what the current guidelines are anyways. So I would suspect that if there are any recommendations that are coming out of the service review, the deep dive that's being done, that potentially new policies would be required to support whatever recommendations the council would choose to go forward. So I think starting fresh at that time to recognize whatever's needed, if there are in fact changes, would be prudent at that time. And this trying to modify something that really doesn't reflect what's happening, probably much easier to start from scratch.
Other colleagues with questions? Councillor Kaibaga.
Through you, Chair, I just had a question on the number 2 item, which says annual retirement dinner, 25-year club dinner, and other civic dinners. I know that it says at the top that this is going to be discussed in the meeting, the council meeting on June 11th. Should we wait to kind of comment on this on June 11th, or should we, like, how can we provide some of the, it says here that we can clarify the type of events that we'd like to see held. Does the clerk know what kind of actions she wants to take on this, or should we wait on the council meeting on June 11th?
I don't know who wants to answer that, but.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the recommendations from today's committee meeting would be forwarded to the June 11th council meeting for consideration. So the recommendation of the staff report is that that policy be amended in accordance with the bylaw that's attached, and council would consider the recommendation from today's committee meeting on June 11th.
So any suggestions would be at that meeting, at the June 11th meeting?
Well, if you had suggestions, I believe you could make them now, since the committee's recommendation is simply going to that meeting. So the clerk mentioned that the draft bylaw is attached. So I think now would be the time to ask questions or make changes. You can always obviously make additional changes at council, but it's always easy at committee to do that as well.
No, because I noticed that it's kind of like open-ended, where it says any other, to clarify the type of events to be held if we wanted to add. I'm just kind of wondering if we can add events that we can hold at the City of London on top of the events that already hold. And I'd like to suggest one if that's possible.
Okay, maybe you can comment on whether we can add events.
Through Mr. Chair, I apologize if the wording is confusing in that clause. What I intended to say was it would clarify that the events held would be a reception instead of a dinner. That's what I meant with that wording. But of course, if you want to recommend any further amendments, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. I'd like to recommend that we add hosting, Black History Month to be held at the City of London instead of outside of the City of London, as it is an event that's celebrated across the country, and it's often held at municipal places or government places. So I'd like to add that into the recommendation.
Okay, so exactly, I just want to make sure the clerks understand where you're looking to add that in, and then I can look for a seconder, and we'll have to make sure we have proper wording. So if you just give us a sec. Go ahead, clerk.
Mr. Chair, if I could suggest, this policy is related to events related to employees. Perhaps it would be an additional clause asking us to prepare a new policy to address this particular event. It wouldn't fall under this policy because this is for acknowledging employees. So it'd be a separate new policy that I would think would need to be created and reported back on.
Okay, so you have some information to say that particular policy is for the employees, and if you want to add something else, you could take an additional direction, which I think you're suggesting would be just an additional clause, the entire report recommendation, to bring back some information on this?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would suggest it would be an additional part of the clause that would direct me to bring back a report with a policy to address a new event with a draft policy for consideration.
So that's what the clerk is suggesting as a possible course of action given this. I don't know if that changes where you would like to land this or if you're interested in that option, but I'll go back to you, Councillor.
I think we should move forward with it, yeah.
So I believe the deputy clerk is preparing some language there. We'll make sure that gets up. Once we can see what it is, I'll look for a seconder and then we can proceed. Maybe in the interim, while we get that language up, I'll see if anybody else has comments on the general overall policy. Nope. Okay, that was worth a try. So we'll just wait for some language and make sure you're okay with it. I'm just going to ask colleagues, this is committee, we can just add that in as one of the components of the recommendation. If colleagues would like to vote on that separately, they certainly could. So I think that that's maybe the easiest course of action is to allow the councillor to add the clause if there are no objections to that course of action. And then if someone would like to vote on that clause separately, we certainly could. I don't see anybody objecting to that particular process. So let's make sure we can get that all on the screen. I need a mover and a seconder for the entire thing, including. So Councillor Kayabaga, Deputy Mayor Helmer. We'll just wait for that to get up on the screen. Does anybody want to deal with that clause separately, or are we comfortable voting on the whole thing?
I'd like to see the clause before I can answer your question.
All right, we'll get it up there. Should be up. If you click current item, it'll be at the bottom as a D. I'm going to read it for the people at home who can't see it. D, the Civic Administration be directed to report back to the Corporate Services Committee with respect to the potential of a new policy whereby the City of London would host an event for Black History Month annually. Discussion? We have the entire thing moved and seconded. Councillor Kayabaga?
Thank you for adding this. I know that it just kind of seems like it's coming from out of nowhere. We're kind of reviewing the policy, so I felt that it'd be good to add this. It's important for our community to participate in something that's being done across the country. It's been celebrated across Canada for the last 10 years. And it's important that the city takes leadership in celebrating Black history. It sends out a strong message to our community and to the employees at the City of London as well.
Any other discussion on this or the entire moved and seconded motion? Nope. Okay, seeing none, we'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 5-0.
Okay, that exhausts our consent items. There are no scheduled items. There are no items for direction. Is there any additional business? Seeing none, I'd look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Helmer, Councillor Hillier, all those in favor? That carries. We're adjourned. Thank you.